Hi, I'm Joelle Campbell from Social Business Wales, and I have Corrina Lloyd-Jones joining me today. Corrina is one of the consultants on Social Business Wales. She works for Menter, our business, and she's going to be joining me today to talk through some really topical HR issues. So we've got some questions coming up, and Corrina is going to help us with those. So our first question, Corrina, for you is, how do clients select which staff are eligible for the job support scheme? How do they choose who to bring back full time? And if they've got to go down the redundancy route, who do they select to put into that pool?
Hi Joelle, thanks for the first question. So this will essentially depend on the business's assessment of their anticipated demand for their product or service in line with their financial forecast before then mapping their resource requirements. And to do that is going to be really tricky over the next few months, but it essentially starts there. The coronavirus job support scheme is limited to jobs considered by the Chancellor to be viable. So the measure of which is that staff must work at least a third of their usual hours. So the government is saying that for a role to be viable, from the 1st of November, staff must work at least a third of their usual hours. So that's the first consideration for employers is, do I have a third of their hours to give them? It's a key component because if businesses do not have enough work to provide even a third of the hours, they won't be able to put those staff into the scheme at all. Some employers at the moment have no work at all for staff in certain jobs, and they can't simply magic up work for staff to do either. It's currently a particular problem for sectors such as hospitality and leisure, sport, entertainment, but could be a situation facing many of us in the event of further restrictions imposed to control the pandemic over the next few months. Employers will need to consider alternative options, therefore, possibly redundancies in the worst case scenario for those employees where there's simply no work available, even if those jobs are viable jobs in the long term. So we'll jump back now before going on to other options and worst case scenario redundancy of, so when employers are considering whether to use the coronavirus job support scheme, the first thing to note is that the percentage of the cost for them as the employers outweighs, and in some cases it far outweighs, the percentage of productive hours provided by the staff to the business. And a stark reality is that the cost is more than 50% more, particularly when you take into consideration that employers will also not only have to pay the hours worked and then the third of the contribution towards the hours lost, but also employers' national insurance and pension contributions. So it costs significantly more than 50% to employ several people working on 40% of the time compared with fewer working full-time. Some employers will instead look to agree a reduced working week with staff where they're simply paid for the hours that they work, but they're not receiving the financial support from the government. Staff would obviously lose out on the additional support then, but from the employer's point of view, they would only be paying for the work actually done. So when we jump back to what I said at the beginning of the response to this question, that it largely depends on the demand for a product or service, on the financial forecast, and then mapping that to the resources. It's basically a step-by-step process and moving through the process to see which option makes more financial sense now, possibly even trying to forecast onto the future as well in terms of skill retention. Given the unprecedented nature of the crisis, it's quite possible, though, that staff or trade unions or representative groups, it totally depends on the infrastructure in place within the particular organisation. They could be open to exploring different options. So if the coronavirus job support scheme isn't an option for employers, either because they don't have enough hours to provide staff or that they can't afford the contribution levels required of them, it could be an option that staff would be open to exploring other options like extending furlough, but that would obviously be at the full cost of the business then, and is probably not something that the business would consider as an alternative to the job support scheme. Reduced hours or pay on unpaid leave. And from the employer's perspective, they'd be paying for what they get, but obviously from the employee's perspective, it's quite likely that they would find those offers less attractive when they're aware that there are government support schemes in place. So there'd be an onus on the employer then to clearly explain the rationale for not using the job support scheme. For example, they couldn't afford to pay for work not carried out, or they can't give a minimum of a third of hours. If employers have some work, but not enough work to keep everyone on their pre-pandemic hours, the absolute last case scenario would be to consider selecting some staff for redundancy while keeping possibly others employed on a full-time basis. There is an argument that it could be unfair to make employees redundant when government support schemes are running. However, the fairness of a redundancy dismissal largely depends on the circumstances at the time, including an employer's particular resources. So it wouldn't necessarily be unfair to make employees redundant instead of using the job support scheme, particularly given the additional costs incurred by the employer in making use of the scheme. So going back again to what I said at the start, it's just really important to really think about what's possible, what's affordable, and then mapping that to the way the business needs to run over the next few months, and being able to explain that and share as much information about that as possible with the staff. In terms of who to select for a redundancy pool, employers have some flexibility in defining the redundancy pool, and it's quite difficult for staff to challenge an employer's choice of the pool if the employer has genuinely applied its mind to the issue. So, for example, if an employer needs fewer staff in a manufacturing facility, the appropriate pool would normally be the manufacturing department. If, however, with that particular employer, there are staff elsewhere who are doing similar work, or the work is interchangeable, it may be relevant to consider them as part of the pool. So, for example, say if dispatch or delivery staff occasionally worked in manufacturing and vice versa, or covered periods of absence in the departments, it could well be the case that an employer would need to cast the pool, the net of the pool further. They just need to consider the circumstances of the situation before deciding. This is a really tricky area. Changing terms and conditions of employment is tricky, it's tricky for HR people, and it's also supported by lots of employment legislation. And redundancy is also a problematic area. ACAS provides some really good advice. They've got some template letters and policies free for employers to use online, and they also have an employer helpline where employers can phone them for further guidance and support. The helpline is also open to employees if employees want some advice from ACAS. So it's always advisable to get some advice for anyone who's not sure about the exact steps to take in the process.
Thank you, Corrina. It's definitely not a simple or a quick process. It involves a lot of thought, planning and calculation. So thanks for talking us through those steps. If you want to have some more information on that, we have our website and we also have a full-length video available on YouTube. If you need support or help, then please get in touch with us at Social Business Wales. So the next question is, how do employers change the terms and conditions of employment? What is meant by meaningful consultation?
Thanks, Joelle. So just perhaps something to emphasise at this point is that we're in unprecedented times. The unprecedented nature of this crisis could possibly allow an opportunity for staff, trade unions or representative bodies, depending on the infrastructure, of course, to be open to discussing alternative options, which could include changing terms and conditions of employment, particularly when faced with business closures of job losses as the alternative. Examples of changing terms and conditions of employment are things like periods of unpaid leave or temporarily reducing hours and pay. All changes would require a period of consultation because they are contractual changes, whereby the employer would provide all the necessary information to the individuals and then give them time to consider that information and ask questions. The type of information that's quite important to share with the individuals during the consultation is, of course, what is actually being proposed, the business reasons for the proposal. So, for example, if you're proposing to reduce someone's hours of work or pay, a reasonable response from an employee at the moment would be, well, why are you proposing to reduce my pay when you could be accessing the government job support scheme? So you'd need then to have the business reasons as to why you're not intending on accessing that scheme at the moment. For example, it could be because, well, we can't guarantee requires, or we can't afford to be paying you for non-productive hours, and we can only pay you for the hours that you're actually working, whereas that scheme requires a contribution for non-hours worked. Those would be business reasons, but you would need to have to share them, and they would have to have been well thought out and backed up by your financial planning information, and then obviously your anticipated demand for product and service over the next few months. You'd need also to explain any impact that the proposed change would have on the employee's employment. So if, for example, you were proposing to reduce hours of work, it would be reasonable for staff to ask, well, how will this play out? Will I work 3 full days and have 2 other days off, or will I work these hours over 5 days or over my normal shifts? How will it work? And you would have needed to apply a bit of thought to that to be able to discuss with them, and for them then to ask questions and say, well, actually, I would be able to do it this way, but I wouldn't be able to do it that way because of, for example, caring responsibilities or whatever. Allowing them time to reflect and being able to ask questions is vital for meaningful conversation. And then when they're asking the questions, that they're provided with the responses as full as possible and on a timely basis. The aim of all of this is to reach an agreement. So it's important to try and open the communication channels and keep the communication friendly and amicable. If an employer recognises a trade union for collective bargaining purposes, depending on the terms of any collective agreement, they could be able to agree the change, particularly reducing hours and or pay with the union. That could then be binding on all employees, or at least facilitate an individual agreement. If, on the other hand, there are no unions in place, employers will need to consult individually with employees to explain the reasons and the necessity for the proposed change with the aim of obtaining employee consent. It's important that during consultation, any consultation, that what the plans and the information you take forward to staff are proposed, that it's not presented to them to say this is what's happening and you're now entitled to ask questions. It's we're proposing that this will happen. We'd like to have your view on it. And that the whole language of that opens up the channels for more friendly and amicable conversations. Any consent or any agreement should be evidenced in writing, and any commitments evidenced in writing should be honoured throughout the period. So if there's been a commitment to review on an ongoing basis, it should be reviewed and the staff should be informed of the results of that review. And particularly towards the end of the agreement, if there needs to be an extension or a different approach at the end of the agreement, remember to build in time to start the consultation all over again regarding the next steps. All of this might enable some employees to remain employed, possibly without pay if you were negotiating unpaid leave, or on reduced benefits until the situation improves, and possibly that redundancies would no longer then be necessary. If an employee refuses any proposals for change after meaningful discussion and adequate time to consider, an employer can impose the change by dismissing and then re-engaging on the new terms immediately after. Or an alternative option would be to consider different measures, which may well be redundancy.
Oh, thank you, Corrina. It's definitely a really sensitive time for all involved, and thanks for talking us through those. Here at Social Business Wales, we have a pool of consultants who are specialists in HR and can support you. So Corrina is one of those consultants. So if you need help and support, please contact us at Social Business Wales to find out if you're eligible. And we also have our full-length HR webinar that can give you some more insight on YouTube. So the next question is, what are the options if there are social businesses who have staff that have been shielding but those staff members don't feel comfortable returning to work, which is probably really relevant in what we're going through at the moment.
Really relevant one here, Joelle. A popular question at the moment and over the last 6 months for many employers. The first thing that I need to stress and emphasize, and I can't stress and emphasize it enough here, is that all employers should consider their position very carefully before requiring an employee to attend the workplace if they fall into one of the vulnerable categories. It's possible that employees who fall into one of the vulnerable categories may be defined as disabled under the Equality Act, and therefore there is an additional requirement on employers to consider reasonable adjustments in supporting them generally in their work from a day-to-day basis, and particularly during a pandemic like COVID. So if someone is refusing to return to work because of a fear of their health condition, if home working or redeployment to a role that's suitable for home working is possible, that may well be the temporary solution. Alternatively, if home working isn't possible, employers should carry out an appropriate risk assessment, a carefully planned risk assessment, and put the appropriate control measures in place to manage the risk, including offering the safest available roles in the workplace, enabling the staff to maintain 2 metre distance from others, maintain personal hygiene, and all of the other considerations that come with a COVID workplace risk assessment. For any support regarding health and safety and workplace risk assessments, there's some really good materials on the Health and Safety Executive website at the moment, and they've got some template risk assessments for different workplaces, which I found particularly useful over the last few months. After discussing any control measures put in place with the individuals, you to take the risk assessment then to the individual. And this is the assessment I've put in place. What do you think? If they continue to refuse to return, the employer would then need to carefully consider the specific circumstances and the reasons that the employee is concerned about. In line then as well with current public health guidance, Public Health have changed their approach over the last 6 months in terms of individuals who are in one of the clinically vulnerable categories. There were shielding letters in place at one time, and then it was to just ensure that you social distance as much as possible. That guidance does change, and it's really important for employers to keep on top of it and make sure that they're acting in line with it when discussing with individuals who are concerned about returning to the workplace. Employers can refuse home working. They can take disciplinary action, and they can withhold pay, but it's really important that the actions are proportionate to avoid a claim of discrimination, because, like I said, it's possible that these individuals are disabled under the Equality Act. If, for example, there's no discrimination risk and public health guidance indicates that employees could reasonably request an employer to ask that a particular employee to attend work, it's possible that the employee could be investigated by the employer for possible misconduct on grounds of unauthorised absence or refusing to follow a reasonable management instruction. And in cases of unauthorised absence, it's unlikely that they would be entitled to any pay. However, employees also have a statutory right not to be dismissed for complaining about or refusing to work in unsafe working conditions. If it can be proved that the main or the only reason for a dismissal was for taking action over a health and safety concern, it will amount to automatic unfair dismissal, and it's possible that a workplace where there was a high risk of contracting COVID-19, which had not taken adequate health and safety control measures, could fall within that category. So employers are minded to advise, currently strongly advised, to be sympathetic to any concerns staff could have and to try and resolve them amicably to protect health and safety. And like I said, there's good reference on the Health and Safety Executive website if you need some more information. Finally then, an employee who refuses to return to work could approach their GP and be medically signed off as unfit to attend work. and could then be entitled to statutory sick pay, and employers would then merely need to follow their sickness absence management procedures. Bear in mind that any COVID-related sickness absence, so for example, if someone tested positive for COVID and was absent from work, the government will reimburse up to 2 weeks statutory sick pay to eligible employers. And if you take a look at the government website, there's further guidance there about how to claim back that statutory sick pay. Alternatively, bear in mind that this pandemic could have made a previous mental health condition that a member of staff may have, let's say, for example, anxiety, harder for an employee to manage. An employee suffering from anxiety, for example, could find their condition is worsened by travel or by being in public places due to increased risk of contracting COVID. And if their anxiety prevents them from attending work in those circumstances, it's quite possible that they'd be regarded as on sick leave and therefore entitled to sick pay because they're unable to attend work because it's associated with their anxiety, which is a mental health condition. Where an employee suffers from severe anxiety, it could amount to a disability, and medical advice should be sought as soon as possible from a GP or even an independent occupational health professional to determine whether they're disabled, and if so, to identify what adjustments, if any, should be made to assist the return to work. And that approach could actually be taken for any employee who could possibly be disabled or who is confirmed to be disabled under the Equality Act. This is a really tricky area, and every circumstance that I've come across to date has been different, and the approach, there's needed to be tweaks in the approach, because individuals are individuals, and then employers' circumstances differ as well. So employers are advised just to seek as much advice as possible. And again, ACAS is a good source on this one.
Oh, thank you, Corrina. It definitely sounds like it's a really important area that employers need to consider all the options. So thank you ever so much for explaining that, explaining some of the options and sharing some of your advice and the links. If you need more help, we are available. But the next question is around policies. And this is a very common one that we're having a lot of. What policies and procedures should clients be reviewing at this time? Because COVID has stretched a lot of us and has impacted in lots of aspects of our lives. So what are the key ones, Corrina, that people should be looking at and reviewing at this time?
Okay, thanks, Joelle. Yeah, you're right there. This pandemic has and lockdown have stress-tested employment contracts and policies, in addition to all of us. Some problems that we're facing require more short-term solutions, and then others need more permanent changes to contracts and policies. And here lies the balance at the moment, really, is basically looking at the current situation in line with demand for product and service and financial forecasting, trying to map then resource requirements against that, and then making changes, possibly temporary changes, and then also doing a bit of horizon scanning regarding, where are we going with this in the future. It is advisable for employers to discuss specific situations before attempting to make changes. Changes to terms and conditions of employment can be a troublesome area, and if not handled correctly, it can lead to employees claiming constructive dismissal on the basis of the employer committing a fundamental breach of the employment contract. So there is quite a lot of employment law guiding this. ACAS has got a really good advice helpline, which can be accessed by employers, and they've got some really good resources online and things as well. Just to note, before I note some policies and procedures that I've been looking at recently, if staff regard their employment contracts and policies as too unfavourable, particularly too unfavourable in the long term, they could simply choose to vote with their feet and leave. Well-judged changes, on the other hand, could present a really good opportunity for us as employers for valuable flexibility to operate in an emerging post-COVID world. So it's this balance at the moment of just getting through what we've got to get through on a day-to-day basis at the moment, but then just trying to keep an eye on the future and perhaps not setting something in stone now that would hold us back in the future. And that is a really difficult task at the moment because none of us have got a crystal ball. So the type of policies that I've been having a look at recently, sickness absence policy, particularly with regard to COVID-related absence. Now, what I found is it's quite straightforward if someone tests positive for COVID, because that's an illness, and the normal sickness absence management policy kicks in, and we support them. And there've been some tweaks to the process along the way. For example, we've learned that the email that members of staff receive to confirm that they've tested positive for COVID actually covers them as a fit note and their self-certification for the first 14 days. So employers don't actually have to have a fit note from a GP until the 15th day. So that's something I've learned recently. But something that I found a bit tricky and I've had to apply some thought to is how do I treat absences like staff being informed by the track, trace and protect system to self-isolate. Now, for staff working from home, if they're not poorly, that's fine, they can continue to work from home. But how would staff who have to attend the workplace be treated? Would they receive full pay for that, or would they only receive statutory pay? These are the type of decisions really that employers need to be asking. In terms of statutory sick pay, employers are entitled, or eligible employers are entitled to claim back up to 2 weeks statutory sick pay for COVID-related absence, and further information can be seen on the government website regarding that. Home working is another policy that I've been looking at and reviewing. I think when we hit the lockdown measures earlier this year, it was more a case of emergency planning. It was more a case of looking at the policies we had in place, making quick changes to them, making sure that staff felt supported and that they could, clarifying what they could take home and what they couldn't take home, and how we could support them, and getting our IT systems up to a standard where we could ensure business continuity. But I'm at the stage now with home working and thinking, okay, are we going to be home for a lot longer? And if so, what are the longer term changes that I need to be making? I've come across some employers who have closed their offices during the lockdown, and they have no intention of returning back to an office. And they'd be advised to thoroughly check their home working policies to make sure that it's accounting for everything at the moment, and also then tweaking their contracts of employment to change the location to a permanent home working location. I've come across other organisations that have temporarily closed offices that they're leasing to save money, but they haven't drawn a line or made the decision that they will be working home permanently, and they've come and asked for my advice. And my advice in that instance is just confirming to staff that, well, you are working at home temporarily for the time being. We have closed the office that you were working with in X location. We may well open another office or reopen that office if it's available in the future. Therefore, your home working arrangement is temporary for the time being. However, we will review with you and we will get back to you on this date. And any commitments for review, it's important to stick to them and to try and put a time frame in place where you're regularly reviewing, so staff can't argue that it's just become custom and practice that they've been allowed to work from home indefinitely. And that's in the case if you are considering perhaps moving back to more a workplace situation in the future, or a hybrid system of working in a workplace and from home. Health, safety and well-being policies have really come into play over the last few months on a kind of operational level, from assessing risk, but also from a general support level. There's a lot more talk now of well-being forming part of health and safety, and the whole physical and psychological safety elements of well-being. It's really important that we are considering how we're supporting mental health of individuals, of organisations and of society as a whole at the moment, because everyone is feeling the pressure at the moment. So looking at the health and safety policies, I've actually included psychological effects of COVID in our COVID-related risk assessments, because I do feel that it's a risk that needs to be considered, and it's something then that I've committed to sharing health and well-being information with staff as a control measure then to mitigate the risk. Then we've got disciplinary and grievance, performance management and redundancy. All of these policies we've been casting an eye over recently, because operational things like if we were to have to conduct a disciplinary investigation now, would we have to conduct all of the investigations online? How would evidence be shared if everyone's working from home? How, if we had to hold a disciplinary meeting, how would we facilitate the right to be accompanied? Have we got the right IT infrastructure in place to make sure that everyone can join fairly? So it's those type of things now that possibly we need to start looking at, particularly if we're going to be in this situation for the medium term. Redundancy policies are being reviewed at the moment, just because of redundancy being a real option for employers that can't make other options work at the moment. There's some really good advice on the ACAS website regarding redundancy, some good templates and letters, and they've also got some template policies as well, which are well worth a look at. Data protection is an important one. I mentioned earlier the whole thing of sharing evidence for disciplinary or grievance investigations. Well, how do we do that securely if we're working from home? If we're taking information or data from the office and we've taken it home, how are we storing that? Normally, employers would have more robust IT security measures in place in an office. Firewalls, for example, it's unlikely that our staff have sophisticated firewalls at all in place at home, or at least the firewalls that are as sophisticated as the employers have. So cybersecurity and things is being tested now, and if we continue in the way that we are, it's going to continue to be tested. So how do we get our IT departments involved in this and thinking, or our IT external support and thinking, how do we tighten up here? Equality and diversity is a vital umbrella policy. It's one that I've familiarised myself with again recently, reminding myself of the protected characteristics and how they might come into play in a COVID world. Disability is quite an obvious one in terms of staff whom are in one of the vulnerable categories. It's likely that they would be considered under the Equality Act as disabled, which adds an additional responsibility then on employers to make reasonable adjustments for them. However, you've got maternity in terms of pregnant staff and how to treat them fairly. So it's important just to keep an eye on your E&D policies, familiarise yourself, because it underpins everything. And when we're talking about meaningful conversation and really looking at the individual circumstances of each case, it's important to bear equality in mind in case there could be a risk of discrimination in these discussions. So it's really important just to remind ourselves of what those protected characteristics are. And then finally, employment contracts. So it's unlikely that employment contracts haven't been affected over the last few months. Some employers would have gone to just change the employment contract altogether. Others would have perhaps confirmed changes to an employment contract in writing. So for example, any letters confirming different arrangements to pay and work under the furlough scheme are likely to have been confirmed in writing in a letter, and that letter then would sit behind the employment contract as a temporary change for the duration of that agreement. What's important with employment contracts is that that you're thinking about the changes that you're making, that you are undergoing a process of meaningful consultation, and that anything that is agreed in writing, and any commitments that are made in writing are honoured during the process, and that particularly you give yourself enough time at the end of the agreement to review where you're going next. So it could well be a bit of a cycle of meaningful consultation for a period until you can navigate yourself out of the woods. It totally depends on the circumstances of each case. And I'll emphasize again that it's a tricky area. Changing terms and conditions of employment is tricky. So seek advice if you can. There's some free advice on the ACAS helpline and things like I said, but also that there's wider advice available, which Joelle will explain now.
Thank you, Corrina. The implications of COVID are definitely weaved through more policies than people probably think straight off. So here at Social Business Wales, we can actually provide support through consultants like Corrina to review and update your policies, especially around your equal opportunities, your qualities and diversities, and some of the key policies really. So thank you ever so much to Corrina for today, for going through those questions and giving such fantastic answers and weaving in some practical advice and examples. We do have our full-length HR webinar available on YouTube. We've also got lots of resources on our COVID hub. So please look at the links attached on this slide and get in touch with us. That's the big message. If you're a social business out there and need support, we're here to help you. So I hope you found that useful, and thank you again to Corrina.
Thanks, Joelle.